Hello and welcome to Building a Kick-Ass Pitch Deck. The key things that you are going to want to present to investors when you're raising a pre-seed or seed round in funding. My name is Corey Wright. I am currently a venture manager at Campus Founders and have a lot of entrepreneurial experience. I've worked in various startups as well as other venture accelerators and have even founded my own companies. And today we're going to talk about the things that I've seen and helped hundreds of startups use in their pitch decks to investors that have enabled them to go on and raise a lot of funding, up to multiple millions of dollars and euros in funding. So normally this is a 2-hour workshop. We're going to go through it a little bit faster today, and I'm going to have you guys pause at the relevant points and do some of the homework exercises. If you're interested in any of these homework exercises or having that worksheet that's associated with them, you can reach out to me at any of the social channels you might find me on. LinkedIn is a good one, and I would be happy to send that over to you. So let's talk about pitching your startup. Well, one of the first things probably many of you already should know about is how to do a really great elevator pitch. Something that you would be able to say to someone at a networking event when you're walking to the door or when you're riding up the elevator, however it might be. And so I'll go ahead and give you an example one here, but the main thing is that you focus on what you're doing for a customer and how you're creating value. So here's an example one, and then I encourage you, if you don't already, to make your own. So my name is Corey Wright. I'm the investment manager currently at Campus Founders Venture Studio. Our company does pre-seed investments for early stage startups in Germany that allows them to finish building their MVPs and gain early market traction. Unlike other pre-seed funds, which require significant traction, major equity stakes, and have long decision-making times, we are primarily focused on strong founder teams and can make investment quickly as you meet different milestones. Please feel free to connect me to any startups that might be interested in working with Campus Founders Venture Studio. So here's an example of an elevator pitch. I'm not saying it's the best in the world, but as you can see, talk about who you are, what you're doing, for whom and why, how you're different, and then always have a call to action. So if you don't yet, go ahead and pause the slide here and practice your own elevator pitch. If you already have one, then let's move on to the next part. So 10 components of a startup pitch deck. There might be more. In a reading deck, you might argue that I am missing some things, or maybe you think there should be fewer things if it's a very fast pitch. The reality is everyone's going to have a different sort of idea of what should be in a startup pitch deck, but overall, I think if you include these 10 things, then you're going to have a really good chance of at least getting your foot in the door when you're trying to raise capital. So the first thing you want to focus on is the problem your startup solves. We're going to talk about the solution, the market, competition, your unfair advantage, why are you special? What's your revenue model? How are you going to make money? And what are the assumptions with that? What's your team? Possibly the most important component here. Traction, what progress have you made? What do you actually need? And where are you going? And what's next down the road? But the key theme with all 10 of these, and this doesn't matter whether it's a reading deck or whether it's a pitch you do at a competition, you need a good story that runs through all of these components. So make sure you tell a story and that story winds its way through, and it can be a financial story, right? You need to make sure your numbers are matching. It can be the problem story. Make sure the problem is clear in every aspect of these components. It can be the user and it can be you. But make sure the story is there and it's coherent and it's clear and it's focused. So let's start. And one of the very first things I recommend founders have in their pitch deck is a nice image sort of showing how they're solving a problem. It's good to have your logo for your company, your presenter name. You want to know who is talking or who's presenting this. And of course, contact information is important. First impressions are everything. So make sure this slide looks really good and it really draws attention to your startup. This is an example from Uber way back in the day. Very clean, very clear, and sort of exactly what's going to be coming down the road at you. Okay, this is a pitch deck about next generation car service, something to do with mobile phones and cars. And note that they have a slide number right here. And so this is important that you put these throughout your deck to make it easier to sort of have people look through things or make notes, especially if you have mentors. And it's a really good idea to make sure you have your logo and a copyright of your company name on the deck as well. Just to make sure that if people down the road get this deck and they look at it, they know who actually made it in the first place and they can reach out to you. Or you make sure that other people have a, maybe a bit harder time trying to copy your slides. So make sure you have that there. And then what you want to do, and this is important, is you want to open with a story that addresses your market's problem. Okay? This story is really important. I like to use personification, where you sort of tell the story through the eyes of a customer, Joe or Jane or Jack at some company that needs this solution, and tell it through their eyes. And an example of that would be Matchbox. So Matchbox, the flirting game. And so here's some slides from their deck. They said, meet Matt. Matt is this guy and he spots a girl he likes at a party, but like many of us, Matt won't go over to say hello. He has the same problem most of us do, fear of rejection. And then they go on to say, meet the cure, matchbox.com, the flirting game. And so what's interesting about this is they use personification, like I just mentioned, and they use that to create a need for their solution. And of course, I think, as you all know, Matchbox ended up becoming Tinder. And so obviously it was a very successful startup, and they had a very good story that they used when they launched their pitch. And so that's what I want you to do next. I want you to sort of pause this video and think about what are some ideas for telling a story about the market and customer problem you're trying to address. All right, so I hope you have a good story that you've come up with. And as part of that story, you next want to think, after you sort of told a story about this problem, I like to have the next slide be sort of a boom. Here's my solution. Here's the startup. And explain what you do in one sentence. So you could say, we make filthy water drinkable. We help surgical wounds heal faster, right? There's a lot of different sentences. These all come from real startups. But it's nice to have, here we are, blah, 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 blah. There's this problem. It's really bad. It's really painful. There's this problem and this problem and this problem that are underneath a big problem. But guess what? We're here and we do X, Y, Z. And we make solutions to these problems. And then, you go into your solution. That's the next thing. So show how it works, have very simple graphics that are easy to read, very minimal text, have that one sentence statement really clean and easy so that when someone reads it, for example, if I read this, automate landlording through software and on-demand labor, I know exactly what this startup's doing. And that should be your goal, that when someone sees your solution, they understand 100% what you're doing and they can directly connect it to the problem that you told them about earlier. So, another homework for you, pause the video and try to write down what you do in one sentence. Make it clean, crystal clear, and very easy to communicate. All right, so as you've written down what you do in one sentence, it's also good to then show your product, right? Screenshots, video. If you're doing an in-person pitch, bring the product with you. Take someone through what it's like to use it. Have a QR code where they can quickly log on and get a demo, or show some GIFs or whatever that are going to really help your customers understand what you've built, and show that you've built something too, right? And this is an opportunity to show you that your team is already executing and making a lot of traction. Don't be afraid to show it, and make sure, even if it's in the prototype stage, that you still really demonstrate what you're building. Let's look at an example. So here again from Tinder, or the flirting game back in the day, they show, well, here's what our app looks like on this phone. You can like or not. You can have matches for people that like you back. You can message people and see what's going on. And beyond that, what you can even do is you can even show, well, what's your secret sauce or what's under the hood? And so here, Tinder said, well, look, we got all these really great features, but even more than that, we have these really great new technologies we're using that's going to make this product a success. Again, note how very few words or text, mostly bullet points, but still very easy to understand why this product is special. Here's an example from Mint, perhaps a little more text, but still makes it easy to sort of see what's the value they're providing in terms of benefits, costs, and quality or ease of use. There's another slide from Mint. So there's an associated pitch deck with this. If you don't have it already, again, reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's LinkedIn-EN, I think it's EN, and then Corey Wright. So, make sure, like what Mint is doing here, that you show why you're unique, So can you explain what's really special about you in one sentence? What are some things that differentiate your product and solution? And investors are really going to want to know this. And why are you not like maybe 3 other startups working on the same thing? What's special in terms of how you get customers, or how you increase retention, or the stickiness of your product, or the little hook you use to really gain market access quickly, right? So pause here and try to brainstorm a couple of things that you think really differentiate your product. And if you don't have those, then maybe you need to go back to the drawing board and work on your solution and your problem fit a little more. So the next batch of slides that's really important is how to describe the market and doing it well. Who's buying? How are you going to acquire them? How much will it cost to acquire them? Give examples. Talk about your pilots. Talk about areas of the market, what it looks like. And so here's an example from a startup called Mattermark. They talk about who needs a B2B search engine. And then they say, well, every knowledge worker in the world, but here's who we're focusing on the first 6 months. And then, then we'll start to focus on these people. And then tomorrow we'll eventually switch to these. So they sort of show that they know their niche market or their beachhead market. And they have a clear sort of focus. And then they also have numbers around that. So they say, well, first we're focused on these 30,000, then we expand into sales managers and professionals, and then, there's $3 billion in revenue opportunity in these other verticals. Here's an example of target market from SEO Moz. Now, I don't really like this slide as much because it's very busy and it's vague and hard to read. It could work for a standalone pitch deck, perhaps, but make sure you don't make your marketing slide too complex. That's hard to know, well, who exactly is Moz targeting? This is a little better from them. They say, well, hey, we're focused on really heavy web developers with lots of experience. And so that's the kind of folks that we target to get this product. They also talked about sort of their targets and where the majority of their customers are coming from. So this is another way to do it. Again, a lot of text, but it could be good if you have a reading deck that you're not just pitching in a presentation. And I also like here that they use examples of real people, real job types that they're targeting. Here's an example from Mint, where they talk about, here's who we focus on getting users when we launch, and then we hit the growth stage, we switch, over to distribution partners and PR, and when we're mature, then we actually do internet advertising. Common theme that I see from startups is they think they can do internet advertising right away in the beginning. That may not always be the case. There might be better strategies to initially start to get into your market. Here they talk about their TAM, SAM, SOM. They sort of do it upside down. So their TAM is actually at the bottom, and then they have sort of, I guess you could say, their SAM up at the top, and then they don't really share their SOM here per se. But they do have a lot of conversion numbers, and that shows that they really know what they're working on. So again, investors like this if you actually know your conversion percentages, like how much it costs to get referrals, and you have a sense of how big that market actually is. So you may be saying, well, this is a lot of different ways. What should I do, or how should I talk about my market? And one thing that I like to recommend to startup founders is using something called the TAM, SAM, SOM. Now, it can be very confusing to folks to actually use TAM, SAM, SOM, and I've seen it done a lot, but often done wrong. And so let me talk about how I like to have startups present this, and you can always reach out with questions. So let's take a non-digital example and pretend that we're starting a coffee shop. And let's say we're starting a coffee shop here in Heilbronn, where I am currently. And, well, first of all, we need to think, well, how many people actually drink coffee and would realistically, come to our coffee shop? So that's where we're going to focus on the total available market. It needs to be people who could realistically be your customer. It shouldn't be the entire value of the coffee market, because that's not realistic. I'm not going to be, attracting coffee drinkers from another country all the time. Like, they might be maybe, 0.0001% of my actual market. So make sure when you talk about your total available market that you're not necessarily showing broad market numbers that don't mean anything when it actually comes to would they be a realistic customer for your business. So in my case, we calculated, okay, there's, roughly 100,000 people in Heilbronn or that live and travel to here. We look at some market numbers from percentage of coffee drinkers in Germany. And from there, we say, okay, we think roughly, 16,000 coffee drinkers here in Heilbronn, and with some assumptions, drinking 2 coffees a week, that gets us 5.6 million annual recurring revenue. But we don't stop there. We say, well, still, even among coffee drinkers, not everyone's probably going to be coming to our coffee shop. Maybe some people only drink coffee at home. Maybe some people have their favorite coffee shop already. And so what we want to do is think about, well, who are the customers with the biggest need or pain? What's the low-hanging fruit? Who are the easiest coffee drinkers to acquire? And so we might say, well, we're going to do a really nice sort of light coffee roast, something that's not very common in Germany, and we're going to focus on people who want a sit-down experience and a light coffee roast. Sort of go for a niche. There's not many of these in the area, and so we're going to attract a bunch of people to our shop because of that. So we might do our own research. Maybe we go out and we survey customers in other coffee shops, and we learn that, roughly, I don't know, let's see, maybe 30% of all coffee drinkers would be sort of in this area. And so then what we can do is, taking our own survey data, we can then multiply it by the market data we have for the TAM, and we get to, 5,000 coffee drinkers and 1.7 million in annual revenue. However, you still can't just assume that, okay, we're going to make 1.7 million annual revenue right away. You don't have the capability, the marketing resources. You don't necessarily even have a big enough coffee shop to, support that much business. So then what you want to think about is your share of the market, or the SOM. Now, this sometimes is also called serviceable obtainable market. So here's how you can think about it. If you already are a startup and you are, showing your previous traction, then share of the market would be the customers you've already obtained. So if in 2021 you had 1,000 coffee drinkers and X amount of revenue, then that's the number you would put there. If you're a startup and maybe you're just getting started, you can focus on your serviceable obtainable market. And how you get to that is you think about what are the resources we currently have and the max amount of customers we could serve. And so perhaps like you have a budget, of, maybe, a certain amount of marketing budget. Perhaps your coffee shop can only hold maybe 150 sales per day. Realistically, it's a very small coffee shop. Maybe you only have 1 employee, right? And so then you calculate down, you say, okay, well, realistically, with the amount of funding that we're getting this month or this year, and our store size and the number of employees that we intend to hire this year, our annual revenue is really only going to be 130K, right? And we'll only be able to serve maybe 500 coffee drinkers while we figure out our marketing. And so that's how you can sort of show both the big picture and why, there's an attractive market that's going to make investors want to invest in your startup, because you can really scale and grow and make a lot of money, but also showing that you have a focus area in terms of your segment available market. Where you're going to sort of niche in and how you're going to sort of start to get a beachhead market. And it also shows that you're realistic about, well, we're a startup and we're going to learn some things. And so, here's our realistic sales numbers or share of the market or serviceable attainable market that we can get in the current funding time period. Here's an example from a banking company, and this is what I was trying to say that I would avoid. So for example, they show, well, top-down banking revenue is 1 trillion. And then they say our gross value wholesale banking is, this big $1 billion number, and we're focused on startup wholesale banking. but they don't really segment down from this. They show these big numbers, but who among these sort of startup wholesale bankings are they actually focusing on? So either this TAM is technically their SAM, or they are needing to sort of provide more data here. So this is a way of how not to do TAM, SAM, SOM. It's not quite clear what's going on here. Here's a great example from TAM, SAM, SOM. This is Airbnb. This was from like, I think 2014 or something. And so they said, hey, we have, all these trips booked. Those would potentially be our market because anyone doing trips would want to stay somewhere in a hotel or in a house. But where we're focusing on is budget and online trips. That's where our specialty is. That's the low-hanging fruit. And from these, like we were able to do 10.6 million last year. Sometimes you can also have, you have to think about, do you show customers or do you show transactions? So for example, this is a startup that I was working on with some people a couple years ago. And, we had to think about, well, maybe our customers were universities, but the real number we were curious about, since not every university is the same, is the number of licensing deals they would do a year at their TTOs. And so we sort of came up with like, okay, we're focused on USA and EU, and the really top universities are going to be where we can provide the most value. And then we think realistically, while we're testing out this software in the first year, that maybe we can get 2 universities to do pilots with us. So take some time. You might even need to take a couple hours or even a couple days. Some people work on TAM, SAM, SOM over weeks. It can be a little tricky. It requires research. It requires surveys and data from your customers. But really try to understand, what's your total market? Where are you segmenting and where are you focusing? And what's realistic for you to obtain this year? So go ahead and make sure you do that exercise. And then let's move on to the next part. So, what are we going to talk about next? You might already be guessing it. It's competition. So first of all, I want to remind you that competition isn't necessarily a bad thing. Competition means there's a market for your product. It means that there's a way to differentiate yourself, and it pushes you to continue innovating and being better than others. So talk about your competition in your slide deck. Who is in your space? Who and how is the market problem currently being solved? Why are you better? If you have trade secrets or patents that set you apart, it's a good idea to mention them. And never bash your competition. They could be people you partner with or merge with or even acquire down the road. So keep it professional. And a good way to really talk about your competition in a pitch deck, you might see like these crossbar charts, but what I really like are matrices. So I like to show, that your startup in the first column, and then show the different features or patents or market tricks or acquisition or whatever makes sense for the startup you're working on, and then be really realistic and differentiate how you line up to your competitors. And it's okay if maybe you're more expensive than some competitors, if you solve other problems really well, if you have other key IP advantages, for example. Here's an example of I think personally it's a really bad example of the competition. See if you can pause and figure out, which company are we comparing here? And you may not actually know. Well, the company's Buffer. So you can see they are over on the far right. And so you need to make sure it's easy to understand what's going on and you don't have these really busy slides that take forever to really get the point across. Here's an example that's not very pretty, but shows a lot of different features that you could look at. It's not a very pretty slide, but at least this person has the sort of check boxes so you can quickly see, okay, well, which company and competitor has which type of features or, sort of can position themselves in the market in different ways. The next thing you want to include in your slide deck is to really talk about the unfair advantages you have. And perhaps you already talked about this when you talked about your solution, or maybe you do it right after you talk about the competition to really say, okay, there is competition. There are other ways that customers are solving these problems. And here's why we can still succeed as a startup. Maybe you talk about a unique technology that you have. Maybe you have a really kick-ass team or a high-profile co-founder who maybe it's a serial entrepreneur who's already raised a lot of funding. Maybe there's people on your advisory board that can open the right doors for you into a market. Maybe you have special insight or data that no one else has really uncovered yet. But the goal here is to convince investors that even if most startups fail, you and your startup still has an unfair or competitive advantage that will let you succeed. So here's a competitive advantage from Airbnb. Nice and clean. I really like this. They talk about why they're going to succeed. First to market, ease of use, host incentives. I think that one was actually key. They sort of say, here's how we can beat out the competition. Here's another example from a startup I worked with a while ago, and this wasn't a startup I worked with a while ago. This is from Dropbox, actually. And so, this is very technical focused, and they talk about how they're able to use Amazon S3 and sort of scale and make it easy for people to share files. And they're using a new code base. Back then it was probably a little bit newer, Python. And so they can develop faster. And then here's actually one from a startup I had worked with. And so, what they focused on was sort of the user journey and how they basically take any users and essentially convert them into customers very quickly by not differentiating and sort of a more multi-use platform. So after you talked about sort of your competitive advantage or your unfair advantage, you really need to sort of show what's your business or revenue model. How are you going to make money? What are you going to charge? What are your margins? So if we go back to our Tinder example, they kept their slide nice, clean, and they said, well, look, it's simple, 2 matches for free and then $1 after that for new matches. And we get extra money by them people paying to send virtual flirt gifts or paying to show up higher. And so, it's very easy to understand, and it's a clear, okay, this is how they make money. This is from SlideBean. They said, okay, we have a freemium model. Advanced is $120 a year. Pro is this much a year. This was Airbnb's. I like this one because they include more data on their deck. They said, well, here's our SOM, our share of the market. And, on average, we get $20. If you think about most trips or most stays being, 3 nights and $70 a night. And this is our revenue that we can get from it. But what you can do beyond what you just saw in these last few examples to really impress investors, and honestly something that you should be doing anyways as you develop your startup and business, is show investors the numbers behind your numbers. So it's really critical that your assumptions are flushed out. So I want you to pause here and try to spend some time and see if you can figure out what's wrong with this slide. Why would I not invest in this company? So pause here and then hit play when you think you have the answer. Okay, so if you're wondering, what's wrong, hopefully you notice that the customer acquisition cost of this fictitious business is actually higher than the customer lifetime value. So, they have a 33% churn rate, which I'm going to remind you is related to the customer lifetime. So basically, it's the inverse of the customer lifetime. And that's okay. You can have high churn rates, especially for apps. And their CTR is okay. Their monthly visitors is fine. Their conversion rate is okay, I would say, for an e-commerce company or a game company. But they lose money every time they acquire a customer. It costs them 97 euros, and they only get 90 euros out of that. So this business can never grow. And in general, right, you need these numbers to actually be much, much higher in terms of the lifetime value to the customer acquisition cost. For SaaS companies, it's not uncommon that it's sort of a 1-to-10 or 1-to-9 ratio of acquisition cost to lifetime value. So make sure your business has a chance of being financially viable, that your cash flow is going to be strong, and that you're going to be able to grow it and not just sort of flatline or go into debt. Here's an example from a startup where they said, look, business model simple, 20% of royalty fees. On average, that gets 44,000 euros a year. But, don't take our word for it. Here's the key business model assumptions that we've been testing to prove this. And, they go into the customer acquisition cost. They talk about the lifetime value and the lifetime, the assumptions associated with that. They talk about other, and for every startup this is going to be different, but they talk about the other assumptions that go into calculating sort of their revenue model and how they're going to make money. So the point here is impress investors by showing them you know how much it costs to get a customer, how often customers are going to leave you, and how much money you're going to get from them before they leave you, and that you have a viable business case, and that you can even just discuss these assumptions with your investors and make sure everything makes sense. Okay, this is arguably one of the most important slides on your deck, so you really want to spend an appropriate amount of time here. You can always, when you talk about your team, mention notable board members if you have them, or advisors. You want to keep the slide clean and keep your focus less on titles and education and more on how you have sort of the capabilities or track record to execute and make the startup successful. It's also good if you have technical or industry expertise, so to highlight that. And don't be afraid to be confident about your accomplishments, because investors invest in people first, product second. We care more about the team than what they're actually building, because a good team will be able to pivot and adapt a product to make the startup successful. But just having a good product, doesn't necessarily mean you have the right team that can take it somewhere. Also, one other trick is to show the first 2 to 3 people you will hire. If you're a startup, perhaps you're missing 1 or 2 key skill sets in your team. And so it's important to show investors that you are aware, self-aware, and you know what you don't know, and you know what the key roles are that you need to move your company's growth levers. Here's an example. It's very nice and clean. I like this. Maybe it would be nice to know who they need to hire next or what the track record is. It would also be nice to sort of have a sense of like who's running the show here. So I like to at least give a sense to investors of who or whom are making the ultimate decisions in the company. This slide is nice and clean. Maybe I would change a few things, but I like how they have the logos on the right. Sort of shows who they've been associated with and why they're moving forward. This is an example from maybe a company that you don't want to copy. Way too much text, hard to read, very busy. However, what they did do right, and as you might notice, this was from a startup I had worked at a long time ago. They talked about their next 3 hires that they needed to grow the team. And so again, when you're talking about your team, don't forget to talk about who you need to bring on next. So the next, exercise that you can pause and work on is think about your team. What are 3 things you're really good at? And so maybe you don't need to hire for those. What are things you're really bad at? And then what are the roles you might need to bring on next? And spend some time with your co-founders and really think this through. And it's okay if it's not going to be right away, but still you should be, thinking about and starting to even, get ready to recruit people, because recruiting can take a long time for the appropriate roles you need to grow your company. Okay, traction slide. So first of all, just a disclaimer, some people might be like, okay, these bullet points here, that's not traction. Traction is sales. Traction is customer acquisition. Traction is growth. And sure, that's a fair point. Traditionally, traction basically just means sales or revenue and growth and users coming into your product or solution. However, for early stage startups, as I'm presuming you might be, you really still want to show investors that you know how to execute. Have you built the product? Have you invested your own money? Are you invested? If you haven't put your own money in, why would an investor want to put their money in? Do you have users already? Have you got some awards, or have you got some press mentions? Has your email list been growing? I don't really care too much what you put here, as long as it just shows that, there's momentum with your startup and that your team knows how to execute, knows how to move forward, and can make things happen. Here's a more traditional slide that talks about traction. So, again, it's just sort of units or sales that they're able to get onto their platform. I think in this case, it was literal like housing units that started using their platform. Here's an example from SEO Moz. And again, you can see here, they show more numbers like what we talked about. And so they not only show, how much sales or revenue that they've been getting, but they also go into a little bit their business assumptions and also, their subscribers and their, churn rates and monthly visits and other things. But still, you can see, okay, they really know their numbers and things are happening, things are growing here at this company. I like this one from Buffer. Buffer is a great company. And they talk about, look, we just launched the web app and we already have 55,000 users. And then here's what's coming next. They sort of combine milestones with what they'd done, but also what they're going to do. This is again from a startup I had worked on. And so we talked about, interviews, surveys, blah, 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 blah. Okay, some action happening, not, maybe that exciting, I would say. But then what we did is we had a second slide where we said, boom, look, we already have 2 pilots that are getting ready to happen with like 2 of the most major research universities in Europe. And so, we have traction. There's interest in this product and we're moving forward with this idea. And that's the main point you want to make is we have a team that can execute and there's momentum happening. Next, you want to talk about your funding needs. How much money do you need? What's it going to be used for? How long will it last? So what are your burn rates? And will you need to raise another round of financing down the road? If you have a valuation, you can put it. How are you seeking to raise funds? Are you looking for a convertible note? Are you looking for a priced round? Is there a term sheet already? If you're in the US or in certain countries, make sure you stay compliant with securities law. For example, don't ask for money from non-eligible investors or unaccredited investors. But, have a good plan. And, I'm going to give you a big secret because often startups have a tough time sort of figuring out, well, how much money should we be asking for? And so it's very simple, actually. Here it goes. You need to think about what milestones or traction will we need in roughly a year or 18 months or 9 months, whatever. But what kind of traction or progress do we need to have made in order to raise the next round of funding? And so maybe, you need to have 200 customers and $1 million in revenue within 1 year to raise the next round of funding. Raise let's say your Series Seed round and you're doing pre-seed now. Well, then you should calculate, okay, to get these 200 customers, how much money do we need to hire a team, to use our customer acquisition costs, pay that money to acquire customers, to build up the product, to pay for admin fees, all of these different things, your burn rate, right? Your cash burn rate, and calculate that backwards from those milestone goals and then come up with a number. And then you can clearly say, we need 500,000 and we're going to use this to get 200 customers and to gain 1 million in annual recurring revenue. And that's going to let us raise our next round of funding. And here's what it'll be used for, right? So, what you shouldn't be putting on the slide is like tons of admin costs and hiring like a social media person and like, and we want to pay ourselves, these insane salaries. No. What you want to show is like a lot of the money is going towards acquiring customers, building the product, and getting you to that next funding round. So just remember, think about the traction you need a year from now, and then calculate backwards what your current funding needs are based off of your cash burn rate. Here's an example from, I forget the name of this company, but they said, look, we need a 600 convertible note. This gives us 18 months of runway, which, by the way, probably not. You spend money faster than you think you will. But nonetheless, they said, we need 18 months of runway to work on these 4 areas. And then we're going to raise another round and turn up the heat. Here's another very simple deck where they didn't want to give a lot of data. And they said, look, we're currently raising. Talk to us if you're interested. And this is why we're raising funding. I like the look of this slide, but I would maybe have a few more details here. Here's a slide where they say, look, we're trying to raise a 3 million Series A. So this is a little more advanced startup. And this is going to help us, get 23 million in revenues within 24 months. So they have a very clear goal that this current round will let them do. When you talk about where you're going next in your pitch and your financials, you can also show financial projections. But just know that what I think many investors tend to care about more are sort of the assumptions behind your revenue model and your market and how you're obtaining that market. And is there a real problem that you're solving? Is there real value to be created? And so you can show these projections, but keep in mind that cash burn is often going to be more accurate than actual profit estimations. Also, I've noticed, especially in some countries like Germany, investors will want to see sometimes 5-year financials. Personally, I think 5 years, you should know 5 years financials and you should have a 5-year financial plan in your own data spreadsheet, online budget program, whatever it is. However, on a pitch deck, I want to see what's happening in the next 18 to 24 months. And then, of course, be prepared to have a strong financial plan for the remaining years outside the deck, and be able to discuss it. Here's an example from from Square. And so they showed, best worst case scenario, medium case scenario. They showed sort of, their base EBITDA or EBIT by the different years and how they were going to grow and what they needed to be able to grow. Here's an example from Mint where they show what's going on and the different costs associated with their business and their annual recurring revenue. This is another one from a really great Series B pitch deck. I like this because it sort of shows their annual recurring revenue and how it's growing on a quarterly but monthly and also monthly basis, as well as what's happening to their cash, and then what they need to do in order to grow and have a proper operating margin in the following year. So main point here, show what's going to be happening over the next 12 to 18 months. And keep it simple, and remember that investors know that you don't actually know how much money you're going to make. So try to have a reasonable assumption based off of your customer acquisition cost, based off of your cash burn rates, based off of your conversion values and your customer lifetime values that makes sense. And you can always adjust it as you get feedback from investors and from the market itself. Okay, this is going to be a bonus slide. And so if you're in Germany and with certain investors, you should definitely never talk about an exit strategy, especially at an early stage of your company. Investors don't really like it. They want to know you're committed and in there for the long term and you're going to make the thing grow. However, sometimes with different US investors, they want to know an exit strategy. And more importantly, perhaps, you need to just be aware of what's going on in the market and what kind of milestones are companies similar to yours hitting when they gain investments or when they get acquired, and what's going on in your space and who are potential partners or strategic companies that would acquire you or that would merge with you down the road. So I would say, even if you don't include this slide, think about, just researching startup comparables and analogs and look for, startups similar to yours that recently raised significant funding or are acquired. And also think about companies that might acquire you down the road. Here's an example from Mint. They said, look, we think our product provides sort of these value creation activities to these 4 huge companies, and they might acquire us. And it actually turns out that Mint was acquired by Intuit. And so they were right in sort of having an exit strategy or an idea in mind from the very beginning. This is from Square. They also talked about, their different potentials that would happen. I think Square actually never got acquired. I think they are either still privately or public. I should probably know this, but point is they, they had an idea of how they're going to grow and create value for future investors as well. So another example of a slide, or on one side we talked about, here's these companies that recently got acquired, and then here's these companies that would maybe acquire us. All right, so we've talked about a lot. We're almost done, I promise. And the final thing that you want to end any pitch with, whether it's a reading deck, whether it's an actual presentation, is to remind investors, what they'll miss out on if they don't invest in you. Why should they be excited? Why are you passionate about this project? Why are you going full steam ahead? And they have an opportunity, a unique opportunity to jump on board and join the venture with you and invest some funding into you. So end with a strong pitch and a strong call to action. And you can always ask for referrals, connection, or money. You can also put, additional slides in your appendix that you can quickly go to if they have questions afterwards. But have a good close. Make sure you leave contact information. Make sure you say thank you. And yeah, try to get investors excited. Here's an example from Square again. They said, here's why you should invest now. It's a great opportunity. There's going to be a lot of growth happening. This was ending side from Lexop, where they just reminded investors of like some really great metrics. Look, we have this 21% month over month growth, really high growth. We've got lots of reoccurring clients, lots of revenue happening. So you can just, make investors excited. And a final reminder, actually, we'll get to that next. Some homework for you to do if you are going through this is really focus on coming up with a draft of your TAM, SAM, SOM. And if you have a hard time coming to actual numbers, then focus on the categories. Who realistically is your customer? That would be your total available customer. Of those, who has the biggest pain or who is the easiest to obtain as a customer? That's your segmented available market. And then how many can you realistically serve of that segmented available market in this funding time frame? And that's your share of the market, your SOM. Some final notes as well on pitch decks and even presenting pitches is, first of all, don't try to answer all the questions. You're not going to get funding within 24 hours of showing this pitch deck. Not necessarily. I mean, maybe if you have the hottest startup on the market, you might. But what I like to say, and this is a bit of an American example, but think of your pitch deck as a nice appetizer, It's not Thanksgiving dinner. You're not trying to give so much information that people, investors, whoever, are overwhelmed and don't even want to read it. It's bloated and it's too much. You want to provide just enough that, they get a yummy taste of an exciting startup opportunity, and they want to come back to you and ask more questions and dig into the details. Remember that a presentation deck and an investor deck are different, so you're going to have multiple lengths of deck, and remember to tailor your investor decks to individual investors, right? Just like with resumes, when you apply to a job, you would make each resume sort of stand out for that job. You should do the same thing with your investment deck. Also, do what makes sense. Every startup and entrepreneur and investor is different. So maybe you need 2 TAM, SAM, SOMs, or maybe there's a unique market platform. And so you have 2. There can be different ways to sort of present information. And there's a lot of good examples out on the internet that you can follow as well. I also recommend that until you actually have to present, you don't put a lot of effort into the look of the deck, and instead focus on the content you need. Focus on that solution. Focus on those market numbers. Focus on building up a financial plan. Focus on understanding your customer acquisition costs. And then start to put that information into the deck and then make it look pretty. Also, a deck's never going to be done or updated, so don't think that you can just spend a month working on a pitch deck and then be done. This is something you'll always be working on, and it's something that you have different versions of, even not for investors, but for example, finding co-founders or perhaps grant funding, or there's other reasons you might have a pitch deck. A pitch deck is essentially a business plan, right? So constantly update it and make sure it's accurate and make sure you have it on hand. Some common mistakes that I often see with pitch decks is too much slides and too much information, and not having slide and version numbers or logos shown at the bottom. So make sure you keep it simple and you keep it clear and focused. Don't delve into too many product details. Make sure if your customer has problems A, B, C, and D, that your solution, the main things you talk about in your solution are things that address problems A, B, C, and D. So maybe feature W, Y, X, Z that are going to address that. Don't also get into too much financial detail. Show your key assumptions, but don't try to show every single cent on a line item or from a budget. No one wants to know that you're spending $10 a month on your domain name registrar, right? That's too much information. Don't belittle competitors, right? Because they might be in the same room as you, or you might acquire them, or they might pitch to you. You want to have good relationships, and maybe there's a reason that they didn't go your route, and you're going to find that out in the future. Don't present false or silly assumptions you can't back up or you don't have data on. Now, a quick word on this. You will have assumptions in your pitch deck. You don't know everything, A startup is all about, unknown unknowns, and you have a lot to explore. But when you do put assumptions into your deck, just make sure they're logical, or they're based on data, or they're based on comparables, or they're based on analogs, or they're based on some research that you did. And it's okay if you don't have things 100% accurate or, factual, but they should be reasonable, and you should be able to argue why you put those numbers in there. Finally, make sure you prepare for questions investors will ask. Use resources that you can obtain from me. There's different investor grading criteria and pitch deck checklists. And when investors ask questions, be short and to the point with your answers. Don't try to argue. And it's even okay to say, that's a great question. Let me get back to you tomorrow with an answer for that. Or that's something that my team member knows. I'm afraid I need to check in with him and get that numbered for you or something. So, be open, honest, and just be very fast with your feedback, and don't give long, drawn-out responses. You don't have to argue and try to convince an investor. You just need to be, logical and showcase why you're creating value. All right, I believe that is the end here. I hope you enjoyed this slide presentation video. It's pretty long. Normally, in person, in the workshops I do, we work through a lot of these exercises and have a lot of questions. So nonetheless, please feel free to reach out to me. That's my business phone number and my email. Always happy to answer questions. I work for Campus Founders, and we do early stage investments into startups. And so if you're interested, please reach out. We have a venture studio, and I'm always looking for interesting startups to invest in as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best in your startup pitch deck. Good luck.